Nobody could touch him. And I mean that literally. Years. Years of investigations, tip-offs, surveillance, the feds, the locals, even people who had every reason to want him gone. Nothing stuck. Not once. Because here's the thing about this man that most people never understood. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't loud. He didn't wave guns around or make threats over the phone like some cheap movie villain. He was careful. Surgical, almost. Every deal he ever made, clean. Every contract, airtight. The man had lawyers reviewing his grocery receipts. I'm not even joking. So when the news broke that he'd been detained, people didn't panic. They laughed. They said it wouldn't last a week. It lasted longer than a week. His accounts, frozen. His properties, seized. And the people he'd trusted with his life? Gone. Phones off. Doors locked. Like he never existed. Just like that. But what nobody knew, not the press, not the public, nobody, was that the crime they pinned on him, he didn't commit it. Someone else did. Someone with a clean reputation, a nice suit, and a seat in Congress. And the only person standing between this man and a life sentence? A girl he'd shown kindness to years ago and completely forgotten about. This is that story. Let me paint you a picture. Tuesday morning. Quiet street. A black SUV pulls up outside a small Italian restaurant that's been closed to the public for 11 years. No sign. No menu in the window. Just a door, a lock, and an understanding. If you don't already know what happens inside, you don't belong anywhere near it. A man steps out. No bodyguards rushing ahead. No dramatic entrance. He straightens his jacket, nods at his driver, old man Choi, who'd been behind that wheel for longer than most people hold jobs, and walks in like he owns the place. Because he does. Jae-won Shin. Now before you picture the Hollywood version of a mafia boss, stop. Throw that image out completely. No gold chains. No screaming fits. No theatrics. Jae-won wore tailored suits that probably cost more than your rent, spoke 3 languages without thinking about it, and had this quiet habit of quoting ancient Korean philosophy mid-conversation like it was the most normal thing in the world. Unusual? Sure. Unsettling? Deeply. But none of that is what made him dangerous. It was his mind. While other men in his world were busy making enemies and spending money they couldn't explain, Jae-won was building. Quietly. Every business he owned was registered, taxed, audited. His restaurants turned real profit. His logistics company had over 300 employees on payroll. His real estate portfolio was the kind of thing you could discuss openly in a bank without loosening your collar. He wasn't hiding. That was the whole point. He was right there in plain sight. Clean hands, clean books. Practically daring anyone to find something. And they tried. Lord, they tried. The feds had a file on him thick enough to prop a door open. Surveillance photos, phone taps, informants who swore they had something solid this time. Every single time. Nothing. His legal team would dismantle a case before it got anywhere close to a courtroom. One investigation got thrown out over a single comma error in a warrant. A comma. The man didn't just understand the law. He used it like a weapon. And the people around him. Loyal. Or at least, that's what he believed. His accountant, Peter Voss, 14 years. Knew Jae-won's finances better than Jae-won did. His lieutenants, Kong Tae-oh and Ray Dominguez, practically family at this point. Men he trusted with things you don't put in writing. Men he'd protected, paid well, stood by when things got complicated. He had built something that actually worked. Which is precisely why someone needed to destroy it. Not because Jae-won Shin was guilty of anything, but because he was powerful enough to say no, and recently, he had said no. Firmly, publicly, to someone who wasn't used to hearing it. He just didn't know yet what that single word was about to cost him. Here's something nobody tells you about powerful enemies. The most dangerous ones? They don't look dangerous. They don't come at you with threats or muscle or midnight phone calls. They come at you with smiles. Handshakes. They sit across from you at charity dinners and ask about your family like they genuinely care. They are polished. Practiced. The kind of people that cameras love. Congressman Dale Harmon was exactly that kind of person. 15 years in office. 3-time re-election. The type of politician who could give a speech about the working class while wearing a watch that cost more than a working man's annual salary, and somehow nobody in the room would flinch. He was good. Really good. At the performance of it all. But underneath that, Harmon was dirty. Had been for years. And the particular motion he was pushing through Congress, a redevelopment bill that would quietly funnel city contracts to companies he had silent ownership in, was his biggest play yet. Millions. Maybe more. All perfectly buried in bureaucratic language nobody would bother reading past page 3. There was just one problem. Jae-won Shin had read past page 3. See, Jae-won owned properties in 3 of the districts this bill would directly affect. He had people, accountants, lawyers, analysts, whose entire job was to spot exactly this kind of thing. And when the report landed on his desk, he didn't make noise about it publicly. He didn't threaten anyone. He simply made a few quiet calls to the right people and made his opposition very, very clear. The bill stalled. And Harmon did not take that well. Now, under normal circumstances, a frustrated congressman has options. Political ones. But Harmon wasn't interested in a long game with Jae-won Shin. Because he knew, everyone in those circles knew, that going head-to-head with Jae-won through legitimate means was a losing battle. The man was too careful, too connected, too clean. So Harmon went looking for a different kind of help. And that's where Marcus Belloni walked in. Marcus the Bear Belloni. If Jae-won Shin was the chess player of the underworld, calm, calculating, always 3 moves ahead, then Belloni was the one flipping the board. Loud, brutal, and carrying a grudge against Jae-won that went back nearly a decade over a territory dispute that had cost him both money and pride. He'd been waiting for an opening. Harmon gave him one. The 2 men met once. Just once. In the back of a private members club on the east side. The kind of place with no cameras and very selective memory among the staff. What was agreed in that room that night, nobody outside those walls was supposed to know. The plan was simple. Elegant, almost, in how cruel it was. They wouldn't go after Jae-won directly. They'd go after the people around him. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't have a clean name. It's not anger. Not exactly. It's that specific feeling you get when someone you would have taken a bullet for, someone you chose to trust in a world where trust is the most expensive thing there is, turns out to have been quietly making different choices. For a while. Without you knowing. That's the kind of pain Jae-won Shin was about to feel. But not yet. Right now he still didn't know anything. It started with Peter Voss. 14 years. 14 years that man had sat inside Jae-won's financial world. Knew every number, every account, every carefully structured deal. Jae-won had paid him exceptionally well. Well enough that Peter had a house in the suburbs, 2 kids in private school, a wife who didn't worry about bills. A genuinely good life built on the back of loyalty. But Peter had a problem Jae-won didn't know about. Debt. The private kind. The kind you accumulate not through bad business, but through bad habits. Gambling, specifically, with people who don't send polite reminders when you're late. Belloni's people had found out. Of course they had. Finding pressure points was what they did best. It wasn't even a difficult conversation apparently. They showed up at Peter's house on a Wednesday evening. Didn't raise their voices. Didn't need to. Just laid out exactly what they knew, exactly what they wanted, and then mentioned, very calmly, that his daughter's school run followed a very predictable route every morning. Peter Voss cried. Then he agreed. Kong Teo was different though. His situation, messier. More personal. Teo had grown up rough, long before Jae-won found him and gave him a real footing in the world. He was sharp, capable, someone Jae-won had genuinely invested in. They shared a culture, a language, a shorthand that didn't need explaining. Which made what happened next almost hard to write. Belloni's people hadn't threatened Teo. They'd bought him. Quietly. Over months. Small gestures that grew into bigger ones. A business offer here. A financial arrangement there. Wrapped in just enough legitimacy that Teo could pretend to himself it was fine. That he wasn't crossing a line. That it was complicated. It wasn't complicated. He just wanted more than what he had. Ray Dominguez held out the longest. Ray genuinely loved Jae-won. That part was real. But when they went after his mother, an elderly woman living alone in New Mexico, Ray broke in about 40 minutes. And just like that, quietly, without a single confrontation, the 3 men closest to Jae-won Shin were no longer his. They were still showing up to work. Still smiling. Still calling him boss. While the walls were already being built around him. He had no idea. The thing about a well-designed trap is that you never see it as a trap while you're walking into it. It just looks like a normal day. For Jae-won, that normal day was a Thursday. Nothing on a schedule that raised any flags. A morning meeting at the restaurant. A call with his property lawyer in the afternoon. Dinner with old man Choi who'd recently had a birthday, and Jae-won never missed those. Completely ordinary. What he didn't know was that 3 nights earlier, Peter Voss had accessed accounts he had no current business accessing. Moved specific amounts, not too large, not suspiciously small, across a paper trail that had been carefully pre-designed to look like Jae-won's work. The kind of financial fingerprints that would take an investigator about 4 days to find and approximately 4 minutes to get angry about. The money landed exactly where Harmon's people needed it to land, tied directly to a warehouse on the south side that federal investigators had been watching for 8 months in connection with an arms trafficking operation. A real operation. Genuinely criminal, genuinely dangerous, that had absolutely nothing to do with Jae-won Shin. But now his money was in it. Documented. Time-stamped. Clean as a whistle on the surface. Damning as anything underneath. And it didn't stop there. Teo had been quietly repositioning things for weeks. Physical things. A burner phone registered under a shell company that traced back, eventually, after enough digging, to Jae-won's personal holdings. 3 meetings logged in a private calendar between Jae-won and people connected to the trafficking ring. Meetings that never happened. But the record said otherwise. Ray Dominguez handled the witness side of it. 2 people, paid, coached, terrified into compliance, who were prepared to testify they had personally seen Jae-won at that warehouse. Seen him shake hands with the operation's ringleader. Seen him. It was thorough. Genuinely, frighteningly thorough. And Congressman Harmon? He was 3 states away at a public fundraiser the entire week it was being executed. Photographed. Documented. Completely untouchable. When federal investigators finally moved on the warehouse and started pulling the financial threads, Jae-won's trail was the brightest one in the room. It practically glowed. His lawyers would later say they'd never seen evidence constructed so deliberately to look accidental. Every piece landed just right. Just believable enough. Just complex enough that dismantling it wouldn't be a simple conversation. Jae-won was having dinner with old man Choi when his personal phone rang. He looked at the screen. A number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. Choi would later say that the moment Jae-won picked up that call, something shifted in his face. Not panic. Not even fear exactly. More like a man who had spent years preparing for every possible threat, and was only now realizing he'd been preparing for the wrong ones entirely. He set down his fork. Didn't touch it again. They came at 6 in the morning. Not because they needed to. Jae-won wasn't a flight risk. Wasn't violent. Wasn't the type to disappear into the night. They came at 6 because that's when it hurts the most. When the street is just quiet enough that neighbors notice. When the light is that specific gray color that makes everything look worse than it already is. 8 federal agents. 2 black vehicles. Very official. Very deliberate. Old man Choi was already outside. He started early, always had. And he watched the whole thing from the driveway. Didn't say a word. Just stood there with his coffee going cold in his hand as they walked his boss out in handcuffs. Jae-won caught his eye on the way to the car. Gave him a small nod. Like I'm okay. He wasn't okay. The arraignment was fast. Almost insultingly so. The charges were serious. Financial conspiracy, material support of a criminal enterprise, a list that went on long enough to make the courtroom feel smaller. ADA Christine Holt stood at that podium, like she'd been waiting for this specific morning her entire career. Sharp suit. Sharper eyes. She laid out the prosecution's case with the kind of quiet confidence that told you she believed every word she was saying. And the evidence that looked bad. It genuinely looked bad. Bail was set at a number most people will never see in their lifetime. His legal team, the same team that had dismantled a dozen cases before, filed the paperwork, made the calls, started working through their usual channels. Then the asset freeze hit. Every account, every property, every business. Frozen pending investigation. And suddenly the expensive legal team that had served Jae-won so well for so many years started having scheduling conflicts. Urgent ones. The kind that come up when a client can no longer write checks. They were gone within a week. And then the others followed. Associates he'd known for years. Business partners. Men who had sat at his table, eaten his food, celebrated wins with him. Phones off. Doors closed. One sent a single text message that just said sorry, can't be involved, and that was it. That was the whole goodbye. It's a strange thing to watch an empire empty out in real time. Jae-won sat in a holding facility going through names in his head, running through years of relationships like receipts, wondering which ones were ever real. Tae wasn't returning calls. Ray had gone completely silent. Peter Voss, the man who knew more about his life than almost anyone, had submitted a full cooperation agreement with the prosecution. 14 years. Just gone. The only person who actually showed up, physically, to that facility, was old man Choi. Brought food Jae-won didn't eat. Sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair without complaining. Didn't offer solutions or false comfort. Just stayed. In a season where everyone with something to lose had chosen themselves, one old man with nothing to prove chose differently. But staying wasn't enough to fight what was coming. Jae-won needed someone who could walk into that courtroom and actually dismantle the wall they'd built around him. Someone sharp enough, brave enough. Someone who, as it turned out, owed him nothing, and yet was about to give him everything. Let's go back. Not far. Maybe 5, 6 years. A completely different season, literally and figuratively. Late autumn, the kind of afternoon where the sky can't decide between gray and gold and ends up being both at the same time. Streets still wet from earlier rain. That particular smell in the air that only exists in cities after rainfall. Jae-won had just left a meeting downtown. Good mood, actually. Deal had gone well, the kind of clean, straightforward win that didn't require much cleanup after. He was in the back of the car, the Rolls-Royce Cullinan, matte black, the kind of vehicle that makes people stop mid-sentence on the pavement, and old man Choi was navigating a side street shortcut he always insisted on taking. Then, a bike came out of nowhere from the left. Not fast, not reckless exactly, just at the completely wrong angle at the completely wrong moment. The impact wasn't dramatic. No Hollywood collision. Just that horrible crunching sound of metal meeting metal. And then silence, and then Choi's voice saying something quietly in Korean that wasn't appropriate for polite company. The entire left panel, gone. Jae-won stepped out slowly. He was annoyed. That part is important to say honestly. This was not a cheap car, and his afternoon had just been interrupted in a very visible, very inconvenient way. He walked around to the damage, looked at it for a moment, then turned toward the person picking themselves up off the ground next to a very battered delivery bike. And stopped. A girl. Young. Maybe 20, 21 at most. Blonde hair everywhere. One knee clearly scraped through her jeans, hands shaking as she tried to straighten up. She wasn't crying. Not yet. But she had that expression people get right before they do. That look of someone doing rapid mental calculations and not liking any of the answers. Something had fallen from her jacket pocket during the impact. A student ID. Jae-won picked it up before she could. Looked at it for a moment longer than necessary. The name, the photo, the university logo, and underneath, almost invisible, a small sticker. The kind food delivery services give their riders for their helmets. She was a student. Doing deliveries to cover her costs. On a bike that had seen better days. In a city that didn't particularly care. He looked up at her. Insurance, he said. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Then just shook her head. Barely. The most honest and defeated no he'd probably ever received. And something shifted. He looked at the car. Looked back at her. Held out the student ID without a word. Go, he said simply. Be careful. That was it. No lecture. No threat. No making her feel small for something that was already making her feel small enough. Just go. She stood there for a second like she genuinely couldn't process what had just happened. Then took the ID, got back on her battered bike, and left. Jae-won watched her go. Got back in the car. Told Choi to call the repair people and never mentioned it again. He forgot about her almost immediately. She never forgot about him. Laura Wilson saw the news on a Tuesday morning. She was doing 3 things at once, which, if you knew anything about Laura, was actually her slowing down. Coffee in one hand, highlighter in the other. Laptop open to something completely unrelated. Television on in the background mostly as noise. That was just how her brain worked. Always had. Give it one thing to focus on, and it finds 17 others. Give it 17, and somehow it manages. ADHD. Diagnosed late. Understood even later. She'd spent most of her academic life being told she was bright but scattered, promising but inconsistent. The kind of student that teachers wrote careful, diplomatic comments about on report cards because the truth, that she was probably the sharpest person in the room who also couldn't sit still long enough for anyone to notice, wasn't something the system had language for. Law school nearly broke her. Twice. But she finished. Scraped through some parts, flew through others, particularly anything involving arguing, picking apart logic, finding the exact moment a story stops making sense. That part came almost embarrassingly naturally to her. She'd passed the bar 4 months ago. Hadn't taken a case yet. So there she was, Tuesday morning, half paying attention to the television, and then the name stopped her completely. Jae-won Shin. Detained. Assets frozen. Federal charges. She put down the coffee. She knew that name. Not from the news, not from his reputation. Though she knew that too, everyone in the city did. She knew it from a wet afternoon on a side street years ago when she'd come off her delivery bike into the side of a car so expensive, she'd gone temporarily numb. She knew it from the way he'd looked at her student ID, and then just let her go. No anger. No consequences. Just go. She'd thought about that moment more than once over the years. More than made sense probably. Now she was watching his face on a news ticker under the word detained, and something in her chest did something she didn't fully have a name for. She opened her laptop. Read everything. Every article, every charge, every piece of publicly available information on the case. It took her most of the morning and she barely moved, which, if you understand ADHD, tells you something significant about how locked in she was. Because when Laura Wilson found something that genuinely grabbed her brain, the scattered electricity focused into something else entirely. Something sharp. Something relentless. She could see it already. Not the full picture, but the shape of it. The way the evidence sat too perfectly. The way the timeline had no breathing room. The way a man with 14 years of spotless financial records had supposedly left fingerprints this obvious. It didn't feel like guilt. It felt like furniture that had been arranged. Every attorney in the city had already quietly declined. The rumors were loud enough. Go against Harmon and Belloni and you're not just losing a case. You're making yourself, and everyone you love, a target. Even the most ambitious lawyers had done the math and chosen comfort. Laura didn't do that math. Partly because she was new and hadn't yet built the kind of life that fear could threaten. Partly because something about the case had reached into her brain and wouldn't let go. But honestly, mostly because of a rainy afternoon and a man who could have made her life very difficult. And chose not to. She picked up her phone. Made a call. And by Thursday afternoon, Laura Wilson, 26 years old, zero courtroom experience, still figuring out how the coffee machine in her small office worked, was officially the sole legal representation of Jae-won Shin. The whole city thought she was insane. She was already 3 steps ahead of all of them. The first time Laura walked into that courtroom, she was wearing a suit she'd pressed 3 times the night before. Not because she was nervous. Obviously she'd be lying otherwise, but that's not why she pressed it 3 times. She pressed it 3 times because her brain kept circling back to it while she was trying to do other things. That's just how it worked. Anxiety for Laura didn't look like shaking hands and a pale face. It looked like a perfectly pressed suit and 17 open tabs. She was ready. ADA Christine Holt looked at her from across the room with an expression that was almost, not quite, but almost, sympathetic. Like watching someone show up to a marathon they hadn't trained for. Holt was good. Experienced. She had a way of presenting evidence that was clean and sequential and very difficult to interrupt without looking desperate. Laura let her talk. Took notes. Asked nothing in the first session that revealed where she was going. Just watched. Listened to the rhythm of Holt's case. The specific words the witnesses used. The moments where answers came just a fraction too quickly or landed just slightly too neat. She was collecting things. The first crack appeared in week 2. One of Ray's coached witnesses, a man named Gerald Foss who claimed to have seen Jae-won at the warehouse on a specific Thursday evening, made the mistake of being too precise. The exact time, the exact entrance, the exact clothing, down to a watch on Jae-won's left wrist. Laura let it sit for a day. Then she came back with security footage from a restaurant 40 minutes across the city showing Jae-won Shin seated at a corner table at the exact time Gerald Foss had just described with such remarkable clarity. Old man Choi was visible in the background. The timestamp didn't lie. Foss's precision had destroyed his own testimony. But that was just the beginning. Laura had spent 3 weeks going through Peter Voss's financial access logs with the kind of obsessive attention that most people couldn't sustain. She'd mapped every transaction, every timestamp, every access point, and she'd found something that Holt's team had either missed or quietly hoped nobody would notice. 3 of the key account movements attributed to Jae-won had been accessed from an IP address that placed the user not in the city, but in a suburb 40 kilometers out. Peter Voss's suburb. She didn't announce it dramatically. She just laid it down in front of the court like she was placing a cup of tea on a table. Matter of fact. Calm. Here is a thing that exists. The room shifted. Harmon's legal team objected. Loudly. In that particular way lawyers object when they're actually worried. Judge Raymond Tate overruled them with the specific expression of a man who had seen too many courtrooms to be impressed by volume. And then came the moment. Laura called Congressman Harmon to the stand. He came up confident. Of course he did. He'd been performing confidence for 15 years. It was basically muscle memory at this point. She let him settle. Let him give his opening answers in that smooth, practiced cadence politicians develop after years of press conferences. Then she started asking about the timeline. Specific dates. Specific meetings. Specific communications between his office and figures connected to Belloni's organization. Not aggressive. She never got aggressive. That wasn't her style. She just kept asking questions that required him to either contradict something he'd already said or confirm something he desperately didn't want confirmed. He contradicted himself on the 4th question. Tried to recover. She let him talk. The more he talked, the deeper the contradiction went. His legal team was visibly uncomfortable in a way that expensive suits cannot disguise. By the time she was done with him, Harmon had given 3 different versions of the same evening, and none of them matched the others. The room was very quiet. Jae-won sat at that defense table watching this young blonde woman systematically dismantle the most powerful man in the room, and felt something he genuinely hadn't expected to feel in that building. Hope. The verdict came on a Friday. Nobody really expected it that fast. These things drag, everyone said so. Weeks of deliberation, appeals, counter-motions. The legal world runs on delay the same way it runs on paperwork. But Judge Raymond Tate was not a man who enjoyed watching his courtroom become a stage, and by the time Laura had finished presenting her case, there wasn't much left to deliberate about. The jury was out for less than a day. Jae-won sat in that courtroom looking exactly the same as he had every other day of the trial. Straight back. Quiet hands. The same unreadable calm that had either impressed or unsettled everyone who'd ever sat across from him. Only old man Choi, who had attended every single session without missing one, could tell the difference. The slight tension around his jaw. The way he hadn't touched water in 2 hours. He was human after all. Not guilty. 2 words. The courtroom didn't explode. That's a movie thing. What actually happened was a strange suspended moment where the air itself seemed to recalibrate. Then Holt's pen stopped moving. Harmon's lawyer put his hand flat on the table. And Jae-won Shin closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Just 3. Then opened them and exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for months. Because he had been. Laura was still standing. Looking at her notes actually. Already thinking about the next thing. The filing. The asset release motion. The 17 follow-up steps her brain had already mapped out. She didn't punch the air. Didn't make a speech. That wasn't her. Jae-won touched her arm lightly. She turned. And for a moment they just looked at each other in the middle of all that noise and chaos. The journalists already moving. The whispers already spreading. And something passed between them that didn't need words. Acknowledgement maybe. Or something quieter and more permanent than that. Then he said, "You bashed my car." She blinked. Then laughed. Actually laughed. The kind that escapes before you can stop it. "You remember that?" "Rolls-Royce Cullinan," he said simply. "I remember everything about that car. What happened after wasn't sudden. Nothing real ever is." Harmon's contradictions unraveled publicly over the following weeks. Federal investigators, now looking in an entirely different direction, started pulling threads that led somewhere much more interesting than Jae-won Shin. Baloney's organization took damage it wouldn't easily recover from. Peter Voss cooperated fully once the threat against his family was removed and documented. Teo and Ray faced their own separate reckonings. The assets were released. The businesses reopened. Old Man Choi showed up the morning after the verdict at the usual time, coffee ready, engine running, like none of it had ever happened. Some things needed rebuilding. Some things were simply gone and weren't coming back. That's the part the headlines don't linger on. That winning doesn't erase the months. Doesn't return the people who left. Doesn't make the walls that were built around you feel less real just because they eventually came down. But Jae-won Shin was still standing. And Laura Wilson, first case, 0 losses, ADHD and all, had walked into the most dangerous room in the city completely alone and walked back out having dismantled it from the inside. Some people are just built for exactly the moment they were made for. And sometimes the smallest act of kindness, letting a broke college girl walk away from a crashed Rolls-Royce without consequence, travels further into the future than you could ever calculate. Innocence, calm under pressure, and a single moment of unexpected grace. They always win in the end.